everyone, and welcome to the Talk They Hear You podcast, What Parents Are Saying, Prevention Wisdom, Authenticity, and Empowerment. This podcast is brought to you by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. Talk They Hear You is a national prevention campaign that aims to help parents and caregivers talk with their kids about the dangers and risks of underage drinking and other drug use. In this podcast, we hear what's working and what isn't, and what might be missing in our efforts to help our kids navigate away from alcohol and other drugs. I'm Debbie Burnt, Director of Parent Movement 2.0, and I'll be your host. As a reminder, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's episode is a two-part series focused on grandparents who are raising their grandkids. This is sometimes referred to as grandfamilies. We suspect many will be listening to us, but we also want parents and grandparents in general to understand this unique family structure because we know all family structures and all parents have the same goal of raising healthy kids. This means we all have a lot to learn from and to share with each other. We start this series today hearing from Lisa Kennedy, who has worked as an advocate for grandfamilies for several decades. Then join us in part 2 of the series where we speak with Charlotte, a grandmother who stepped up to raise her grandchild when her daughter began to struggle with addiction, a situation that many families face. Both Lisa and Charlotte have so much wisdom to offer, so let's get started and say hello to Miss Kennedy. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Good morning, and how are you?
Very good. So glad you're with us. As a quick introduction, Lisa has spent the last 25 years advocating for grandfamilies to ensure that their voice and that their needs are heard. She has worked in the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, PennCares, the Pennsylvania Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, and the Systems of Care and the York County's Department of Human Services. Lisa is a mother of 4 adult children and grandmother of 5. She has created a parent network series and is generally a remarkable person. So thank you so much for being here with us.
It is my pleasure.
Great. So you and I have talked that grandfamilies, so grandparents raising grandkids, is a unique situation, but it's not necessarily uncommon. And I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about that on a national level and then a local level inside your state. But is there anything else that you would share with us about your background and how you came to this work?
Well, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today and talk about a really important area that sometimes is overlooked. And that's really sort of looking at diverse family structures. And in this case, we're talking about specifically grandparents raising grandchildren. And it is an area that has grown exponentially over the years for various reasons. And we will get into that later on. But I got into focusing in this particular area in some of my work years ago as I began to get involved in the educational system and providing supports to my children, but also connecting to others within the community and seeing the increased need as well as the roles and responsibilities shifting a little bit based upon parental needs and concerns with parents or challenges with parents and having other family members who are stepping in to support children and families. And thus, we have, in some cases, multi-generational families that are raising grandchildren.
Did you tell me nationally there's about 13 million kids that are being raised by grandparents?
Yes, there's a large number of children being raised by grandparents. And again, as you mentioned, I'm in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, we have approximately a little over 90,000 grandparents who are raising grandchildren, and they are raising somewhere over 195,000 children. So that's a lot of children. Several of our southern states have the larger populations, such as Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana. They have a larger population of grandparents raising grandchildren. And there's a large percentage, somewhere around 70+% of those families, those grandparents, who are living below the poverty level as well. So that presents certain challenges that are just indicative of being in that position of need prior to taking on additional children.
So I want to dive into grandparents find themselves in that primary care position again. But first, I just would like to talk a little bit about if you are a grandparent and you're finding yourself in this position. I just want to just say thank you, you know, from
Absolutely.
right
Absolutely.
everyone. And is there anything that you would, any ideas or tidbits that you would say right now to those families just to validate what they're doing and things like this is hard and don't beat yourself up about it and anything along those lines?
Well, I'll say in some cases, this might be something essentially that's considered normal because we do have a lot of families based upon current family structures, based upon societal needs and cost of living, those kinds of things that impact one's ability to be able to manage independently. We may have situations where grandparents are raising grandchildren and you have multiple generations in a home, and it's not a case where children have been, let's say, removed from biological parents and then placed with grandparents, but we might have a large percentage of families who are living multi generational for financial reasons. And in some cases, to also, let's say, based upon work schedules of parents, they may be providing care in that level. So I want to recognize and own that particular piece of it as well. And then for those grandparents who are in a position who are raising grandchildren based upon specific needs or circumstances that have arisen, it is something that's tough. It may not have been something that was planned, something that you didn't see coming, something very unexpected, not only for you, but recognized unexpected for the children as well. And so both are on a challenging trajectory as they adjust to reasons why the family structures are coming together. And so, again, as you said, yes, don't beat yourself up. Begin to find a place to build routines and create systems of safety. And I don't necessarily mean physical safety reasons. Of course, that's important, but safety for emotional safety, mental health, for personal family structure, and rebuilding that family network collectively together so that families will see, or children will see, that despite whatever reason brings them to have the need to be being raised by grandparents, their basic needs are being met and they aren't missing out, so to speak, on any of those particular things. Now, raising grandchildren, your decision making process is going to be a little different. And so, think about some of the ways in which you're going to have to make different decisions, and who you consider along the way will be different as well. So, embrace the changes. Don't beat yourself up. Take the time that you need to adjust and clearly understand that as adults, we need routine and time, but recognize that the children will as well. And we need to give them the room and space to do that as well.
I think that's such an important statement. And there's parts of that that I think apply to all parenting as well, right? You have to take the time um,
Absolutely.
when anything is changing in your family to let all parties shift and come to their own, what would you say, understanding or comfort or resolve with it. One thing about grandparents that I love is that in many cases, they hold more of the family history and they have kind of a broader vision of the members of the family. And I think that is something really unique and a real, I want to say gift, maybe that's a little silly, but a real value that they bring to their grandkids in any situation. We've had neurologists on the show that talk about adolescence is a lot about fit and understanding where you as a young person fits in the world, and a lot of that,
Absolutely.
right, a lot of that gets determined inside or gets expressed and gets explored inside the family. I feel like that's a place where grandparents really do have a leg up and can really bring that. Are there other uniquenesses like that that you think grandparents might bring to their grandchildren?
Absolutely. I was going to say, recognizing the generational differences oftentimes is sometimes in our day and age now, you might find that grandparents and grandchildren aren't separated by multiple generations and as in age. Now, there used to be, in most cases, that you would find elder grandparents who would be in their, let's say, 70s or 80s as grandparents. And now you're finding that grandparents are younger in the last couple of decades and oftentimes a little more closely connected in age to their grandchildren and might have, in some cases, some like experiences, might have had some shared experiences, which can also be helpful along the way. And then when you're talking about maybe more than one or two generations in a home, you have that benefit and that gift, as you used, of the wisdom of those elder generations that sometimes can get nowadays overlooked because everything is moving so fast and by virtue of the internet and social media and the ways in which we're moving, that information and the time to digest the information isn't always something that young people are doing, but it is something that grandparents have the capacity to understand and the wisdom to impart to young people if we take the time to encourage young people to hear what their elders have to say in regards to that. And oftentimes we may have some differing experiences based upon the decades that may be between the grandparents and the grandchildren, like technology and the introduction of little ones who who are literally born with the ability. And there's an opportunity for young people to be teaching their grandparents as well how to use and access those pieces of technology, because as the adults providing care for those grandchildren, there's a level of awareness that you want to make sure that you have. So many apps for young people to communicate with others, not just in their community, around the world, and you may have no idea that this is occurring if you assume that as long as I don't hear someone crying and I don't hear someone yelling and I've given breakfast, lunch, or dinner, all is well. You want to make sure that you're tuned in, because if you aren't engaged with your young people and we as the adults aren't raising our kids, the streets will, the TV will, the internet will, all of those pieces will do that for you, and you aren't in control of those outcomes at that point.
I totally agree. As you were talking, I was thinking exactly that. I mean, the technology issue is universal. I love the idea of youngers helping elders engage in the systems. And I also like the idea of grandparents helping kids realize you can have fun and not be connected. You can be creative and not be connected, and bringing some of that know how to the family is really kind of an exciting opportunity.
If I can, I'd like to just expound upon that piece a little bit, because it is something that is overlooked, and really understanding that. First, I will say I love technology. I love all the bells and whistles and all of the gadgets, but I have a golden rule in my home, and I had it for my kids, and it's the same rule for my grandkids, is if you can't do it manually, you don't need a device. It's key in my house, because when those things break down, because they do, the young people are at a loss. They then don't know what to do. And for me, that's just unacceptable. So it's really understanding that we need to master the skills of reading is fundamental, and math skills and all of those pieces that we need to really have mastered, again, age appropriately, before we really unleash the technology and the devices. Because I'm sure we all have experiences of being in a store and checking out, and the machine doesn't give you the right answer, or something happens to the technology, and in a lot of cases, particularly for young people, they're at a loss. They don't know what to do.
We could spend the whole episode talking about that. I agree 100%. Just the ability to look at someone in the eye and have a conversation, that
Yes,
one, there's all kinds of
absolutely.
right, those analog skills. So we are, though, a program that talks about substances. So let's kind of switch into that. Find yourself parenting again. It's important to look at that. And how do you find grandparents are dealing in this space? Do they understand the substances of today, and do they know what they're looking for? We may actually get to have a couple of grandparents in this situation talking to us that we will add to the show. And so I'll get to ask them directly, but what do you see and how do you look at that?
I think it's oftentimes a mix, and that mix will be based upon what age bracket the grandparent may fall into as to their awareness and connection and understanding around substance use and addiction and smoking and vaping, the other things that sometimes are not thought of. Oftentimes, if it's just not a bottle of alcohol or some sort of drug you purchase on the street. And so really having grandparents have an awareness and understanding. First of all, give themselves a break. They don't have to be experts in this field, but some key things that you want to be aware of and make sure that you learn a little bit about beyond alcohol and maybe illegal drugs on the street, understanding the impact of prescription drug use and abuse, and thinking about inhalants, particularly for older generations. They may not have an awareness of said chemicals that kids may experiment with, and someone who may think that, well, it's okay to have eat someone who smokes marijuana because of whatever your personal beliefs and feelings are about that, but it's a different thing when that marijuana is then laced with fentanyl or a bunch of other kinds of things that there usually isn't an awareness about, and an understanding the impact of access to these kinds of things very different than it was years ago and decades ago. It may be one particular area of a town, or it may be one particular place you could go, and by virtue of access now, things are easier to find than before. And so having awareness that your kids may see and or be exposed to certain things that are outside of your control. So access is different, location is different, reasons for use are really
Yeah.
different nowadays. It isn't just I like a drug or I like this bottle of alcohol. It's a lot deeper. It's oftentimes masking pain, it's masking trauma, it's masking abuse, it's masking abandonment. And so oftentimes root causes that push young people into being exposed to these types of things are things that we need to be looking for. And oftentimes that doesn't mean that you need to be sticking your finger in that young person's face all the time, but it is about the adult having an awareness to pay attention to some of those key kinds of things. And when you get that little twinkle tinkle in your belly, or you get that little nudge in your brain, or that little voice inside says something to you as the adult, pay attention. And it may not necessarily mean that you need to overreact and blow up with the young person, but it may mean that you need to document some things. You may need to take some notes. You may need to pay attention to changes in behaviors. You may need to pay attention to changes in types of friends that your young people are engaging. There may be changes in their own attitudes and personalities. So it sounds or can be overwhelming, but it's the little things that we intuitively as adults really do get that sixth sense. And I encourage you to pay attention to that.
I love when you're talking about the idea of taking some notes. It seems particularly relevant if you're new to raising this child. So, documenting a few things so you can kind of look back over time and see changes, and did that little twinge that I got become something, or did it go away? So it's a way of training yourself too in the knowing of these new little humans, or in this different knowing of these humans. But I think that's an interesting concept for all parents, right? I mean, life moves fast, and keeping a few notes, especially if you have multiple children, you get focused on one. It's almost journaling or diary, but with a little bit more intention of my tweak notes.
Use those devices. I encourage
Yeah.
you. You may be old school with pen and paper. That's great too. Keep a pad by your bed. Keep a pad maybe in your pocketbook or something you carry regularly. But also, those technology devices have note sections and areas where
Yeah.
you can plug in. And there's tons of information in my note section of my phone because that's where you don't have to commit everything to memory. The easiest thing to do is have some place to put information and document and track. And particularly if you are seeing or you're getting that twinge or that sixth sense, or you're seeing some immediate changes in behaviors or friendship circles or things that they're doing that they're maybe showing you a red flag, and you may want to pay a little bit more attention before you start to inquire. Make those notes there. Put a date on it and maybe the time of day, because sometimes when you're looking at certain things,
Yeah.
times of day impact one's behavior and shifts as well.
That's such good advice. So the idea that if you do need help, you have this record is so powerful. I also think the idea of getting to know this young person more deeply is really interesting. You have a list of behaviors that I think you say you can flip the switch on. I even think of my own parents when they would be with my kids for extended period of time. And one of my children was incredibly demonstrative and talked back, and she was a little difficult to be around sometimes. And my parents would get tired of her. Nothing major, they'd get over it. But the way to reframe that talking back, when I heard your list, it really resonated. The way you talk about, you can reframe the child that talks back as a child having courage and being honest. And I would add the ability to speak truth to power. And you can see these tendencies in a child and start to think about them a little more deeply, and then possibly flip the switch on what looks like a negative behavior into a positive behavior. You have that list in front of
I
you.
have
I would
some
love
of
to
them,
just hear.
absolutely some in front of me, but if I could before, just
Yes.
give you a little frame around, you know, why that's important. And part of the reason why I talk about this piece is helping us to be able to look at things in a more positive lens. And I will say, human beings, it is very easy to go to the negative. It's quick, it's easy, it's usually in your face, it's right
Yeah.
there, and you can point it out. But oftentimes it takes a little work to get to the positive. And so I encourage you to see past what we would consider a negative behavior and see the good in that behavior and maybe what the root cause again of that behavior is, but also thinking about the generational differences and the gap in ages between potential grandparents and grandchildren and the way in which young people are raised are really different. And when you have older grandparents, it's the era of usually kids are seen and not heard, and they have their place and stay in your place, and there are boundaries that you just don't cross. And while they may welcome sharing a thought or an opinion, it's oftentimes when you're asked, and we live in a different age. So, a couple of the terms on my list as for a child who may be seen as someone who talks back, like you mentioned, courage and honesty. A child who may be seen as dependent, consider them as connected and desiring to be relating to the individual that they're with, as opposed to seeing this dependence as a negative. Looking at a child who may be very rigid, who's just very structured, needs everything in the same place. There may be some children who, particularly due to transitions in their life and experiences and trauma, don't deal very well with change. And so rigidity sometimes is how they determine a sense of order. So looking at that as really needing to have their life make sense to them, as opposed to they're just so rough and rigid and don't have room for change and difference. See a daydreamer as someone who's a visionary. And for little ones who dream of the world is your oyster. And we tell young people that all the time. We want them to be able to dream. And oftentimes nowadays, particularly in school settings, you find little ones, pre K and kindergarten, who don't have a dream. They don't have any hope, and they don't understand the value behind having a dream. And usually that dream is Superman or Wonder Woman or what may be unrealistic to us as grandparents, but there is that imagination in there that still reminds them that there's an ability to dream. How about the little one who
Right.
tests you all the time? We can all think of someone who pushes our buttons, who tests us, who questions everything. You may have the why child. Everything has a why behind it. And look at those kids as potential researchers and experimenters, and those who are going to push the boundaries in a good way, who are going to ask maybe those tough questions and maybe push you, grandmother or grandfather, to think a little bit more deeply. So there are some ways in which to look at some of those characteristics that are often seen as negative or frustrating to adults, to be able to sort of reframe that and flip the switch to see them in a more positive light.
I love all those, and those are obviously valuable for all parents. So, do you think it's important that we talk about reasons why grandparents might find themselves in the primary care role again, and then the little bit about the role of trauma, just so we understand?
Sure. So searches has really been capturing common themes around families who find themselves in these kinds of positions. And again, going back to the substance use disorder, a large percentage of families are in that position because of some form of addiction or abuse of a parent. And that often may not necessarily mean that the parent isn't in the home. They could be, or they don't have to be. Increased levels of incarceration, particularly of mom, this
Mhm.
day and age is changing a little bit. Also, taking a look at the impact of illness, be that mental illness with parents who are struggling with some sort of major mental health disorder or a terminal illness. And certainly those paths can look differently, but the impact of illness, despite the origin of that illness, really has impacted the role of family structures.
Right.
Divorces have impacted grandparents raising grandchildren. Particularly, we see sometimes where parents are divorced, and again, because of finances, you may find that you're in a multi unit dwelling where you may have one of the parents, but you still have grandparents who are there and may be the primary caregivers as well. And then there's just cost of being human,
Right.
which is, basics of life and surviving and managing and being able to maintain a job and maintain your finances and meet the needs of your children. And if, let's say, the children may have some sort of illness and or a need where the parents are unable to provide that level of care. So it doesn't matter what position you find yourselves in that gets you to raising that grandchild, but research really indicates there are some common themes around substance use disorder, divorces, incarceration, medical and health issues, and finances. And then when you take a look at those identified themes, you must consider the impact and role of trauma. And I know there has been in this current decade a lot more research and information and conversation around trauma and the origin and impact of trauma, really understanding that you can have two individuals go through the same traumatic experience, but the way in which they process that trauma could be completely different between those two individuals, whether they are, let's say, two siblings that the grandparents are raising. They're going through the same sorts of traumatic experiences, but the way in which they are able to bounce back, respond, process, receive, be okay with, move through, push through are really, really different. And so I encourage grandparents to see each one of those children as individual and understand that they may have some different types of needs and they may find themselves needing to do a little bit more for one than maybe the other or vice versa. So understanding that trauma, it's a very real thing.
You had said to me that for young people, and probably applies to all people, that traumatized teens can end up with one emotion. and that emotion is typically anger. Yeah, and
Yes.
there's some ways that you were describing ways that anger might get expressed that I think might be valuable for anyone listening, honestly.
We know that there are a world of emotions that we all can experience and express and share and label. However, when individuals, be they children or adult in this case, that have been through types of trauma and maybe years of different types of trauma, you sometimes can lose the ability to process and understand and feel different ranges of emotion. And so you may see children or adults who, in the beginning, had very healthy emotions. They were very expressive and could be happy, sad, and easygoing and engaging and laughing, and have moments of anger because of being upset by a toy that breaks or whatever the case may be. And then as life happens to those young people. And as it keeps
I know.
happening, and if there isn't enough time in between these experiences to process through, let's say, each event, that glimmer of understanding emotion and the expression of emotion begins to diminish. And you see a lot less of change in emotion. It doesn't mean that you don't see it, but when you ask them about their emotions and how they're feeling, it isn't registering to them that they have had happy moments, that they have had moments of fun and laughter, that they have had enjoyable times. Everything to them becomes just about the anger because that's all that they can muster and manage is time after time, trauma after trauma is pinned up, built up anger that leads to having one range of emotion. And the range of emotion that goes from that huge list that we talked about and shifts into usually just one, and it can become explosive. That degree of anger is going to be at 100 for breaking a pencil, the same way that it would be at 100 for major incident. So they
Right.
don't have the capacity to understand the varying degrees of an incident. The breaking of a pencil is really not that serious of a thing. So understanding that emotions have range, but that range can change.
Adolescence is just an incredibly emotionally charged time. And I think it's a struggle for all parents to understand what is all that behavior and where is it coming from. And there's the trauma, and then there's all the biology too, right? All the hormones coming online and all the socialization. There's just so much that's happening. Giving everyone permission to recognize this time, look at this time. I love your tool of taking notes to see if these behavioral tendencies or emotional tendencies are consistent or not is so important for everybody. And then what I'd love to talk about now, and maybe even to kind of end us, is the a little bit about the systems of services that are out there. Like you said, you may have known these grandchildren intimately for a long period of time. It may be new. What are some things if a grandparent finds themselves needing help or thinking maybe I should get some help? How should they look at that and what should they consider? Anything along those lines.
Sure. So, again, keeping in mind that experientially for these grandparents, based upon what generation they are coming from, their knowledge of systems and awareness of systems may be minimal. So, you may live in what I call resource rich states, like Pennsylvania is a resource rich state. But if you don't have the awareness, it doesn't matter how rich in resources a location is. So, a lot of states do have state kinds of services that are available, like kinship care kinds of information, like toolkits. I know in Pennsylvania we have a grandparent connection website that provides a world of resources for grandparents, but also thinking about support groups locally, maybe in your community, maybe in your church, It's also understanding that education probably looks a lot different as well for grandparents, and understanding expectations and the differences that are now happening within a school setting that weren't necessarily happening before. Understanding what documentation you may need, and knowing whether you have been court ordered for the children that are coming into your home, or whether it's just an understanding that I just took my daughter's children in because she's struggling and needing a little bit of a break, and understanding what paperwork you need, like guardianship and custody and medical rights and educational rights. All of those things become important dependent upon how you find yourself within that position and the role that the parent may or may not still play. We tend to look at our school settings as the hub and wealth of information, because schools now are providing a lot more than education. School buildings are now the hubs of a lot of community kinds of services, and we're feeding our kids sometimes based upon programming all 3 meals a day, and providing after school programming, and knowing that you can get, in most cases, some form of therapy and treatment in your school setting versus needing to find a private organization or a private agency to be able to seek those services.
You listed some websites, and I know the ones you listed were local, but we will definitely put those in the description of the podcast so anyone listening could look at what's in your state and then look for that in their state. And I think I heard you say doctor, pediatrician is important, school is important, and these are places where a grandparent can start if they think they need help. Inside the school setting, would a grandparent go to the school counselor first? I think every student in a school has been assigned to a counselor. Is that where they go, or do they go to the principal? What do they do?
It's a very good point, and understanding chain of command and who to ask appropriate questions of. And oftentimes, their first contact is usually the administrative person that's at the desk when you arrive. And usually, that's where you
Okay.
walk in. Families will just start giving them all of their information. And then they end up having to be sent to somebody else, and then they have to repeat that process all over again. So it's really sort of having a sense of what kind of challenge you think you're having. So if your child is having some academic struggles with a subject or in a class, you want to see that teacher. And I say subject because as kids move through middle and high school, it becomes more than one teacher. If you feel like your child is displaying some sort of deficit academically, maybe you think they might be dyslexic based upon some patterns that you're seeing there. You want to have a conversation with your teacher, of course, but you can inquire a school counselor. A lot of schools also have social workers, and understanding that guidance counselors and social workers are really two different
Okay.
roles. I keep a little cheat sheet of the major roles in a school setting and where you go to see those specific things, because it saves parents, grandparents, any adult from having to have 4 or 5 conversations before you get to the person that you really need to speak to.
Continuing to ask, the idea that you're going to have to learn these systems that are around you and how to support is a reality. And don't shy away from that. Keep asking the question. Sounds really important.
Absolutely.
Let's wrap up. You have a lot of great theories on praise, the fact that grandparents who find themselves in the primary care role again, I just really want to say thank you again for that to all of those grandparents that are stepping in. It's so important. And you've talked about praise for them, praise for kids. Tell us just a little bit about why you think praise is important.
Every person needs to be honored, valued, made to feel worthy. And oftentimes, when we go through difficult situations and circumstances, and it takes us time to bounce back, whether we are children or adults, it takes us time to adjust when we're thrust into new circumstances. Maybe we don't have all the information that we feel that we should have to move forward, but we're put in a position where we need to now make some decisions, make some moves, take some steps. And oftentimes it becomes overwhelming, and we get to a place where we forget to recognize what good is occurring. And as I said earlier, it's so easy to fall back on the negative and identify what's wrong and what's happened and what's not going right and who did this to me and whatever the case may be. And those things have their place, but it is also important to really recognize and highlight the value and worth of each and every person and honoring them with some praise. And when I talk about praise, I don't always talk about things that we need to purchase or buy. That's great. We can buy those kinds of things, whether it's their favorite toy. It is okay to buy and purchase, but we also have to find ways to verbally express and share and honor with others how we feel about them and how we see them. Particularly children really isn't that difficult. They may be in a whirlwind of challenges and experiences, but they went to school and they came home and they brought the book bag back, and they've had a history of forgetting their book bag every day. Praise that child for bringing that book bag back home. It takes 10 seconds to send the praise, and praise can just be a thank you. Praise can be a celebration. Praise can be a hug. Praise can be a handshake, a high five. It can be I'm proud of you. It can be I care about you. It can simply just be when they come in the door, how was your day? And oftentimes young people want to please adults. It's innate. So it is something that they want to do. They want to be honored and know that we as the adults care and value them. And while you're doing that, it teaches them as well to be that way with others. Because to be able to see that in others is important as well. So you're setting that example. Recognition is important in how you honor and value and see them. And particularly for scenarios and family structures that may be new or thrust upon family units, you need those highlights. You need those encouraging times.
Well, that was beautifully said, and is absolutely a message for all parents. And I just appreciate your being here today and opening our eyes to this unique family structure and how important it is, and how we can all support those in our community that are grandfamilies and be on the side of everybody winning, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to share my experience, my journey, and what I'm seeing looking in the realm of diverse family structures, and particularly with grand families and the challenging ways that can be presented with this family structure, but it also is very rewarding as well. So I thank you for the time to share, and I appreciate it.
Excellent. Continue learning with us about grandfamilies by listening to part 2 of this episode. In it, we will hear what it's like to be raising a grandchild firsthand from Charlotte. And we want to remind listeners that the Talk They Hear You material included in this podcast can be found on the Talk They Hear You website. Please share this site and this podcast with your friends. The more we can be in conversation with each other, the better for everyone, especially our kids. Lastly, we would like to hear from you. Would you like to be on our show? Do you have stories to share, or tips or techniques that have worked or not worked for you as a parent? Do you have questions for us or any feedback on topics or improvements of any kind? We know that your input will help us design the most useful interviews possible. For any of this, please contact us at WhatParentsAreSaying@gmail.com. Again, all spelled out, WhatParentsAreSaying@gmail.com. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.